Welcome to episode 278 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Neil Herman and retired NYPD Detective Lieutenant Kevin Hallinan. They review the 3-year crime spree in the New York metropolitan area that culminated on October 20th, 1981, when 11 members of the Weather Underground, a radical domestic terrorist group, carried out a Brinks armored car robbery in Nyack, New York. Using high-powered weapons, the terrorist group stole $1.6 million. During the robbery, they shot and killed guard Peter Paige. During their getaway, they also shot and killed Nyack Police Department Sgt. Edward O'Grady Jr. and Police Officer Waverly Chipper Brown. This case, codenamed NYROB, was the first major investigation of the FBI-NYPD Joint Terrorism Task Force, JTTF, after it was first formed in 1980 to investigate the growing number of terrorist acts targeting New York. During the interview, Neil and Kevin also discussed the early days of the multi-agency FBI-NYPD JTTF partnership, the first in the country. In the show notes for this episode, there's also a link to an old article which summarized the original Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, signed by the head of the New York FBI and the NYPD commissioner. Neil Herman served in the FBI for nearly 26 years. During his career, he primarily worked national and international terrorism investigations. As supervisor of one of the New York field offices, JTTFs, from 1992 until 1998, he coordinated the activities of all federal, state, and local investigators. His team accomplished 5 extraterritorial renditions or extraditions of international terrorist subjects so that they could stand trial in the U.S. Neil has appeared on camera in hundreds of interviews regarding terrorism-related matters on all major networks and on 60 Minutes. Retired Detective Lieutenant Kevin Hallinan served in the New York Police Department, NYPD, for 25 years. He was the co-commander of the FBI-NYPD Joint Terrorism Task Force, and on 4 occasions during his law enforcement career, the director of the FBI cited him for his contributions in fighting the war on terrorism. Kevin holds over 30 citations from the NYPD and has testified before the U.S. Congress on domestic terrorism and venue security. He received the U.S. Attorney General's Award for Exceptional Public Service. After leaving the NYPD, Kevin served as Senior Vice President of Security and Facilities Management for Major League Baseball for over 20 years. Kevin is the author of Over the Wall, From the Dangerous Streets of NYC Through the Birth of Counterterrorism and Beyond. His memoir about rising from beat cop to detective and fighting terrorism alongside the FBI. I am honored to have these 2 legends in law enforcement on FBI Retired Case File Review. I purposely made their case review the first for 2023. Consider this episode and the one that I'll post next week an acknowledgement of how the Bureau has changed and how much it remains the same. Please listen to the very end when Neil and Kevin recognize the commitment of active agents and those in law enforcement today. Their heartfelt messages and words of wisdom are truly inspirational. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com. You'll also find links to where you can buy me a coffee, join my reader team, and learn more about me and my books. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Neil Herman, and retired NYPD Detective Lieutenant Kevin Hallinan. Hi, Kevin. Hi, Neil.
How are you, Jerry?
I'm excited. You have no idea how thrilled I am we have covered on FBI Retired Case File Review a number of cases involving terrorism in New York. I did the FALN interview. I've done interviews about the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. I've done interviews, of course, on the World Trade Center bombing and 9/11. But you too were there at the very beginning when the FBI and the NYPD started coming together as a force multiplier, working terrorism cases. So that's what we're going to talk about today. The beginnings, kind of a timeline. And then we're going to go deep into the NYROB investigation. We'll also have a chance to talk to Kevin about his new book, Over the Wall. And I look forward to that too. We've got a lot to cover. Neil, you want to go first?
The world of the modern age of terrorism, most people would probably relate to that beginning on 9/11, 21 years ago. But the reality was 30 years before 9/11, at the Munich Olympics in Germany, 11 Israeli athletes were murdered. The same group a year earlier in Manhattan put down 3 devices in the metropolitan area. The same group, Black September, affiliated with the PLO, were responsible for those devices. The United States Attorney's Office and the FBI was just beginning to compete in this world of modern terrorism. And Khalid al-Jawari, the individual who was ultimately responsible for these devices, was arrested some 20 years later in Rome International Airport. But the modern world of terrorism really began approximately in 1974. When I arrived in New York as a young agent previously assigned to the Miami division, the FALN began a series of bombings, which created 160 devices and bombings in New York, Chicago, Miami, Washington, D.C. The investigation lasted for approximately 7 years. It was the beginning of what ultimately became the foundation of working a terrorist group within the continental United States. This case was probably best known during the Francis Tavern bombing in January of 1975. The group was responsible in Lower Manhattan for continuing its assault on America for approximately 7 years. The same year, in Christmas holiday, 1975, at LaGuardia Airport, there was an explosion that to this day is probably the largest unsolved act of terrorism in America. 11 people were killed. It was one of the worst crime scenes that I saw as a young agent in New York. That investigation went on for many years. The subsequent airplane hijacking in 1976 from JFK International to Paris was responsible by the Croatian 5 individuals that were prosecuted. That hijacking set off a series of events in the New York metropolitan area, to include working on the Orlando Letelier assassination in DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. in September of 1976. Ronnie Moffett and Orlando Letelier were murdered in a car bomb 16 blocks from the White House. It was a tremendous investigation. It was supported, financed, and initiated by the Orlando Letelier assault on Augusto Pinochet, the president of Chile. That, along with many bombings in the late 70s in New York by the anti-Castro groups at the Cuban Mission and other locations in Midtown, set off a wave of bombings in the New York metropolitan area. The Croatians, Omega 7, Serbians, Albanians all began to develop and support this kinds of acts of terrorism. In the late 1970s, leading up to when the formation of the task force was formalized in May of 1980, we would respond to these crime scenes, the FBI and the New York City Police Department, keeping in mind there were 2 cultures. We were competing with each other. We were interviewing the same witnesses. Evidence was secured at different locations. It was very competitive. There was a rivalry that was developed by the FBI and the New York City Police Department. In late 1979 and early 1980, the powers to be in New York, namely Bob McGuire, the police commissioner, and Kenneth Walton, the deputy assistant director in charge, were responsible for forming what would become the first Joint Terrorism Task Force, May 19th, 1980. The Bank Robbery Joint Terrorism Task Force was formed several months before, and we worked hand in hand with the Bank Robbery Task Force. We actually sat in the same area in the New York FBI division. the investigations over the years would be jointly worked. It was a very simple memorandum of understanding. It was a very simplistic document where agents and detectives would partner in these different events and tragedies involving terrorism. At this point, primarily, it was domestic terrorism. There was other areas in the New York division that was responsible at that time for overseas acts of terrorism. As the years went on, the Joint Terrorism Task Force continued. And of course, October 20th, 1981, the tragedy at Nyack, New York, this bucolic hamlet 40 miles north of New York City, was the scene of a tragedy that in effect became Nyack's 9/11 20 years before 9/11. It was a tragedy that unfolded and set off a wave of investigations with the Joint Terrorism Task Force that literally wrote the book on how the FBI and the New York City Police Department would parlay and work together. After the task force was formed in 1980, the FBI continued its investigations over the years in a series of major investigations that included successful trials. The New African Freedom Fighter case was formed, and conspiracy, weapons, plotting to commit these acts. And the task force was continued and became a branch of 3 squads, multiplying the events that were occurring not only in the United States, but also overseas. In 1988, on December 21st, the bombing of Pan Am 103, a tragedy over Lockerbie, Scotland, was really a major act of terrorism that the FBI, working closely with Great Britain, Scotland Yard, and the Scottish police, and all those in Europe, were responsible. New York played a major role. Many of the victims in that case were from Syracuse University and had families in the metropolitan area. We played a major role in working through the Washington field office and overseas to continue that. The bombing of Pan Am 103 led to the period of the 1990s, the murder of Meyer Kahane on the streets of Manhattan, and subsequently the investigation leading up to what ultimately became the World Trade Center bombing in February of 1993, a case that shook America. It shook it to its core, but it didn't break America, and it set in motion how the FBI and the Joint Terrorism Task Forces were being deployed and investigating these crimes. It showed and led to overseas international act of terrorism renditions. We brought back 6 people and stood trial. We eventually arrested Ramzi Youssef in Islamabad, Pakistan, and we brought to a conclusion a case that really set the tone for how international terrorism cases. The subsequent trial of Sheikh Rahman in the Terror Stop investigation was the conspiracy to blow up landmarks, bridges, and tunnels in New York, and ultimately the Manila Air investigation, which we investigated in New York and coordinated the plot to blow up 12 American airliners over the Pacific. The 90s ended with the tragedy of TWA Flight 800 over Long Island Sound in 1996, probably the most expansive investigation that we were involved with the National Transportation Safety Board, and certainly under the direction of James Kallstrom, was an incredible 2-year investigation. I left the Bureau in 1998, and then, of course, the bombings in East Africa and the bombings of the USS Cole off Yemen, where 19 soldiers were killed in a suicide car bomb. That, in 30 years, was the summary of what we did with other cases like Unabomber, like Oklahoma City, which we were involved with.
A number of the cases that you have mentioned, including Flight 103 over Lockerbie, including a number of the things that you've mentioned, I have already conducted interviews, and I will list those episodes in the show notes for this particular case.
The case that really stands out, the case that really set the tone for the foundation, the case that anyone that had its association with, whether it was an FBI agent, New York City detective, an investigator from all the surrounding areas, the Brinks case, that really set the tone, that really was the foundation for what the task force was set up to do, was October 20th, 1981. That was the case in Nyack, New York case number 918-22662, major case 37, murder, theft of interstate shipment, bank robbery. This was the case that was in effect 20 years before 9/11. This was the case that any agent, any detective, any investigator from New York State, from Westchester County, from Rockland County, and the surrounding areas. This was the case that had the biggest impact on how the task force was formed. This was the case that had a heartbeat that set the tone for all future investigations in the terrorism field in the United States.
Wow. All right. This was the major case, but way before this group of people had already been involved in activities, but nobody at that time was there to put it all together. Did we want to talk about some of those incidents and some of those cases before we get deep into NYROB and dive deep into the case? Could you set it up?
You have to remember that this group of individuals, it goes back, the indictment itself really begins in 1976 and leads up to subsequently they're indicted in 1982. The indictment begins in 1976, which is 5 years before October 20th. 1981, what it showed was there were a group of individuals, primarily from remnants of the Weather Underground and the Black Liberation Army, later becoming the May 19 Communist Organization. This group of individuals were responsible for, one, committing armored truck robbery, bank robberies, prison breakouts, to include one of the major predicate acts leading up to October 20th was the Joanne Chesmar Assata Shakur escape from Clinton State Prison in New Jersey. These were the people that orchestrated and successfully broke her out of jail. She is still to this day, as far as I know, and I believe is still being protected by the government in Cuba, as was Sherry Dalton, and a number of other fugitives from other groups, to include the FALN and other violent crimes. What it showed was the FBI would respond along with the New York City Police Department, whether it was in Paramus, New Jersey, Livingston, New Jersey, Danbury, Connecticut, up and down the East Coast, all the way down to Virginia, where these groups of individuals were successfully committing these acts of terrorism. What happened was it took a force of individuals from law enforcement that began collecting evidence, finding safe houses, securing weapons, and in effect, realizing that these groups of individuals, approximately 17 individuals over a long period of years, were responsible for committing these acts of domestic terrorism. But October 20th of 1981 was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. We had a shootout at the Nanuet Mall, moving with several vehicles. Kevin can get into any of those areas that showed this propensity for violence that exploded in this bucolic small city, Nyack, New York, just 40 miles north of Manhattan.
Neil, let me know what you were doing at the time. And then, Kevin, if you could tell me what you were doing when this incident occurred.
At the time of the event in October of 1981, I was working at the time on a Croatian special in the New Rochelle office and was not in Manhattan on the day of the event. I really became intricately involved in the case really beginning in 1983 after the first trial. I was involved with my partners, people like Dave Mitchell, Kenny Maxwell, who had been promoted and went to Washington, became a supervisor, and the investigation into the fugitive aspects of Marilyn Buck and Matulu Shakur and Sherry Dalton. The final three fugitives was my introduction primarily into the case and was involved with the second trial after the arrest of Marilyn Buck and Matulu Shakur.
Kevin, where were you?
Jerry, I, at that time, was the commander of the Manhattan Robbery Squad and had that job about a year. The day that happened, that evening, I was on my way home, having heard on the radio, obviously, what had taken place. I actually live about a mile and a half away from the incident at Nyack. So this was really close to home.
Could you paint the scene for us? Because you were there, you saw the devastation. Could you go into detail for us?
Yes, there were police cars, state police, all the different towns, all the way up this Route 303, which was close to the area where one of the fugitives escaped into. They were going into homes. They had dogs out. They're going through the area. It was totally chaotic. Obviously, great concern on the part of the residents of Rockland County. They had never seen anything like this before. I was on my way home going through a series of roadblocks they had set up, and I started to realize that this is turning into just probably the biggest thing that ever happened in Rockland County. One thing I should mention, Neil mentioned earlier about the 17 individuals back at some of the other actions that these terrorists took. At Nyack that day, playing different roles, there was a total of 11 individuals involved. Incidentally, 5 of them were females. It was October 20th, 1981 in Rockland County, New York. It was 3:35 in the afternoon when a red van pulled into a parking lot adjacent to the Nanuet National Bank. There were 6 male blacks in the van, one armed with an M16, one with a shotgun, and all equipped with 9mm handguns. At 3:45, one male, Quasi Balagoon by a name, African name, stepped out of the van and walked to a bench nearby the bank entrance. We learned actually later on that this same male always positioning himself to come behind security guards. If the so-called primary team were not able to neutralize the guards, he would. At 4 p.m., the Brinks armored truck pulled up in front of the bank. 2 guards left the truck, entered the bank. The driver remained in the truck. Minutes later, guard Peter Paige and Joseph Trombino exited the bank, Trombino pushing a hand truck with the money sacks they had received. The red van moved quickly. In front of the bank, sliding door opened up, and Chewy Ferguson, with his M16, opened up on one of the guards, Peter Paige, striking him in the throat and in the shoulder. The second guard, Trombino, was struck in the shoulder. He went down. A second male with a shotgun shot out the windshield of the Brinks truck. Trombino was on the floor, and one of the black males, Brown, jumped from the van and ran and grabbed all of the money sacks. They jumped back in the van and pulled out. The robbery took probably less than a minute. They drove north on Route 59, about 2 miles up the road, pulled into a Corvette's shopping area, drove to the back loading area. There was supposed to be a U-Haul truck waiting for them. That was a few minutes late. The truck arrived, and as they ran from the van to the U-Haul truck, there was a young college girl who was home just from the day, who lived in a house nearby. She was able to view this group running from the red van into the U-Haul truck. They raised the back loading door, and they all climbed in. She saw the weapons. She yelled to her mother, and then she called the police and advised the police about the red van and what she saw. And that's when the police began communicating over the air about the U-Haul truck. The young woman also saw a tan Honda, which was alongside the van when it pulled in. She did not see the drivers of the van, nor did she see the drivers of the U-Haul truck. The U-Haul went north on Route 59 for several miles. Police radios were broadcasting the information they had, particularly about the U-Haul truck. The U-Haul ended up stopping for a traffic light just by Mountain View Avenue, which was a street that you could take for about 100 yards and then turn up into an exit onto the New York Thruway. As the U-Haul was waiting for the light to turn, a police car driven by Brian Lennon made his left off Mountain View up to the road leading to the Thruway entrance. Sergeant Eddie O'Grady and Detective Arthur Keenan were in a second car. Sergeant O'Grady alerted Police Officer Lennon to block the exit. Nobody should get through. Then he drove up next to the U-Haul, followed by Police Officer Waverly Brown. So now there are the 3 of them next to this U-Haul. The driver, David Gilbert, this white couple, if you will, and Kathy Bodine stepped from the U-Haul talking with the police officers. Police Officer Lennon had a shotgun in his hands that he'd taken from his patrol car, and Kathy Bodine began getting hysterical. "I'm afraid of guns. Please don't do this." Sergeant O'Grady, they thought that possibly they didn't have the right people because there was no mention of the 2 whites. So Lennon was told to put the shotgun back in his car. Detective Arthur Keenan started asking Bodine, who's in the truck? What's going on? And she refused to answer. He heard something drop inside the truck. He went to the back, tried to lift the door in the back of the truck. It wouldn't go up. As he stepped away from it, the door opened up, and the 6 males, again armed with automatic weapons, came jumping out of the truck and firing at the police. Police Officer Waverly Brown was the first to be hit by Ferguson with 3 bullets from his M16. Sergeant O'Grady was firing away with his handgun, which was a .38, and he ended up, as he's reloading, he's shot by Ferguson as well with the M16. They're firing their 9mm guns, and everybody's starting to flee. Officer Waverly Brown is down on the floor, but apparently dying at that point, as is O'Grady, because he's shot 3 times as well. All of the fugitives firing their guns, aided by Marilyn Jean Buck, who also had pulled up in the scene. The only white member of the BLA at that time went to draw her 9mm out of a boot and ended up shooting herself in the leg. Chewy Ferguson with the M16 threw a motorist out of a car and jumped in behind a steering wheel, went about less than a half a mile up the road, made a left-hand turn thinking it was a street. It turned out it was a lone road with a couple of houses at the end. He attempted to turn it around. He slammed the car into a tree, jumped out, ran to the back of the house, grabbed the shovel, buried his M16, his 9mm, and an ammunition pouch, and fled into the woods. The others, the tan Honda, was driven by Judy Clark. She picked up David Gilbert and Samuel Brown. They got into the car. They started to leave. Susan Rosenberg, another member of the group, she picked up Sundiata, one of the males, and was fleeing with him. Sherry Dalton got Natula Shakur and a second male in the trunk of her car, and she was leaving. The Honda and the Oldsmobile fled up Mountain View, made a right on Christian Herald Road, and there was a police chief who worked in a nearby town. He was sitting on Christian Herald Road, just off the road, figuring that whoever was involved in the shooting might flee in his direction. And that's exactly what happened. 2 of the vehicles came flying by. He gave chase and ended up in Nyack, where the Oldsmobile with Rosenberg driving made a quick right-hand turn. Susan Clark, following in the Honda, couldn't negotiate the turn and went straight across the street into a brick wall. So there's Clark, Gilbert, and Samuel Brown in the back seat. The police chief set up his car to serve as a cover as he took his gun out and yelled for them as David Gilbert started to get out and come forward. He stopped him in his tracks by yelling, and then Judy Clark was getting out of the car. She seemed to be reaching for something. Eventually, she obeyed his orders and put her hands up. Brown was injured in the back seat, so he didn't move. 2 Orangetown detectives came by and assisted with the apprehension. It turned out that Clark indeed was reaching for a loaded 9mm, which was underneath the seat. They were arrested. Kathy Bodine attempted to walk away from the U-Haul truck up onto the highway, and an off-duty correction officer was in a camper and heard the shots, pulled his camper over, saw her fleeing, and he was able to get across the highway and chased her down and brought her back at gunpoint. So there were some apprehensions. Bodine was arrested. Gilbert, Brown, and Clark were taken into custody. After that, they obviously went into the courthouse, but 3 days later in Queens, New York, detectives on the Van Wyck Expressway saw a car that had been identified as being parked in front of one of the safe houses and used by the people there, picked up on the plate. It gave chase and ended up in a gun battle with a Nathaniel Burns and Samuel Smith. It turned out that they separated while firing their 9mm guns. Detective Erwin Jacobson ended up in a one-on-one gun battle with Sundiata, ended up putting a bullet in his temple. He was, by the way, as all were on that day, wearing bulletproof vests. And Sundiata, in his pocket, had a spent bullet that had been fired by Sergeant O'Grady that had knocked him down, just bruised him because he had the bulletproof vest. He had the bullet in his jacket pocket. So we knew, obviously, we had the right guy. Burns fought it out until his gun jammed, and he still had 10 bullets in it when it did jam. and he was taken into custody.
Well, first, I have to say that if you had a crime where something was going to go wrong, this was the ultimate. It sounds like they were so used to having orchestrated these type of robberies before that they thought that they knew everything and that nothing would go wrong. And on this day, it sounds like everything went wrong.
And unfortunately, it cost 2 police officers and a bank guard their lives. But as Neil said earlier, those killings of police officers, small town police officers being killed like that, really was a unifying cry to all law enforcement that we all had targets on our backs, and we best come together and make sure we bring this reign of terror to an end. And probably just about beginning of 1982, I was contacted by the police commissioner and told that I would be the new commanding officer of the joint FBI-NYPD terrorist task force, and I was to report there immediately. And of course, Brinks was right at the top of not only that case, but so many others with the FALN and all the other groups that were unfortunately planning bombs and doing jailbreaks and everything else.
And then what transpires over the next period of several years is several state trials in Rockland County under the direction of Kenneth Gribbetts, the Rockland County District Attorney, involving a number of these individuals for state charges in a massive courthouse with security that was unheard of at the time. Cost to the taxpayers was astronomical. Federal trial in Manhattan, which concluded in 1983. And the then beginning of a massive fugitive investigation of Mutulu Shakur and Marilyn Buck for the next 3 years, at which point Marilyn Buck was arrested, ironically, in Dobbs Ferry, New York, approximately 10 miles from Nyack, New York, during an ongoing surveillance based on information that was recovered in a Baltimore safe house. Marilyn Buck has described herself as a anti-imperialist freedom fighter, was described as the only white person associated with the Black Liberation Army. She originally, in 1973, received a 10-year sentence for acting as a gun runner for the Black Liberation Army. And 4 years later, while on furlough from a prison in West Virginia, she walked away from the prison and became a fugitive until her arrest in May 1985. During this period of time, she was a fugitive. She was still involved with committing these acts of terrorism. In 1990, while she was a fugitive, she entered a plea agreement after her arrest and was sentenced to an additional 10 years for having taken part in the bombings of the U.S. Capitol. The U.S. Capitol bombed $250,000 in damages, and she pled guilty to that until her time after she was convicted in the second Brinks trial in 1988 with the Mutulu Shakur. She was given 50 to 60 years of sentencing, and she was released approximately 11 years ago and died in her home in Brooklyn a month after her release when it was revealed she had cancer.
Jerry, I'd just like to mention, which I did with the arrest by Queens detectives, in the vehicle these two were driving, they found in the trunk automatic weapons, ammunition, walkie-talkies, radical literature, ski masks, wigs. They found plans of the Queens County Criminal Court. They found highlights of the plans of the Office of the District Attorney in Queens, police duty rosters, names of individual cops. Again, the same type of, if you will, materials were found in all the different safe houses that were found, including explosives, wigs, phony identification, etc. All of these safe houses had these type of materials.
Marilyn Buck was really the group quartermaster. She took it upon herself to procure everything from armaments, automatic weapons, safe houses, false identifications. These individuals were very clever yet insidious in how they protected themselves for so many years. It took a stream of FBI agents, police detectives, officials from multiple states to coordinate these searches of these safe houses. And that ultimately led to the arrest of Marilyn Buck in Dobbs Ferry in 1985.
And also, Jerry, when Marilyn Jean Buck was taken down, after a 17-hour surveillance from Baltimore to New York. She was armed with a .38 fully loaded on her hip when she was grabbed and went to go for it when the detective and agent leaped from their car to grab her and bring her down. Her comrade, Linda Sue Evans, had a fully loaded 9mm as she made a run for a diner and again grabbed by the surveillance people. What was interesting with Buck, when she was arrested with Burns that night and brought into FBI headquarters, she noted the kind of car surveillance were driving, what they looked like, type of weapons they had, where in the FBI building, the floor where the terrorist task force was located, the descriptions, etc., etc. I was in the room with Ken Walton and several others during the interrogation, and she had descriptions of all of us. When she got into the federal house of detention, she got 4 legal pads and wrote and filled each one of them with all the details of just what she had seen that day to help, if you will, her comrades. She gave those legal pads to Susan Tippegrad. This attorney was involved directly in the escape of William Morales, the FALN bomber. She was, again, a thorn in our side right from the beginning. But Buck, after knowing that she was probably going to jail for a very long time, had the presence of mind to try and still contribute to what she was involved with.
You have to keep in mind that during this period of time when the first trial had ended and the fugitive investigations were ongoing and intensifying, we were able to show how really remarkable Buck was in this role. They used to go to cemeteries and get dead children's dates of birth and deaths, go back into the courts and recreate people's lives. So when the FBI or law enforcement, the task force members would try to trace these aliases from state to state, from predicate act to predicate act, they in effect recreated a person's identity for a lifetime that in effect never happened. They created that from the inception of the baby's birth and death, but did not include the death, and then used all kinds of pertinent information that only parents would have known and no one would be ever able to trace. And that ultimately led to the investigation of Mutulu Shakur. In 1986, my partner, Dave Mitchell, in New York, and Dana Ingalls in Los Angeles, based on information supplied out of the safe house in Baltimore, led us to several associates of Mutulu Shakur. The investigation proceeded out in the Los Angeles area. Teams of agents, Kevin can get into this. We were able to secure key FBI agents and New York City detectives that would be able, in the cover of securing these kinds of surveillances, to try to lead us through payphones, safe houses, and other personal identification where we knew associates of Mutulu Shakur would help hide him. That led, after extensive cooperating witnesses and these surveillance teams over a period of months, utilizing all kinds of secure, classified aircraft, all kinds of surveillance, phone records. After a period of several months in the Los Angeles area, we were able to trace and locate Mutulu Shakur, who was arrested on February 11th, 1986. We were unable to secure his partner, Sherry Laverne Dalton, who was the only remaining fugitive who subsequently died several years ago on the island of Cuba.
It was amazing, Jerry, the fact that in sending this group out to L.A. based on the leads that had been developed, I guess one of the questions we should have asked the agents and detectives we were sending, can you play basketball? Because the group that Mutulu associates, if you will, used to hang out in this playground area and play basketball. And it was believed that Mutulu at times would show to play.
Kind of hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. Neil, how many, was it 2 months we were in L.A. looking?
We rotated surveillance teams out there. Dave Mitchell and Dana Ingalls were the point people in the Los Angeles office, along with representatives from Los Angeles. We were able to set up all kinds of surveillances for at least a 3-month period. It was a very extensive, ongoing investigation. There were ebbs and flows in watching certain payphones, other locations that led us to the associates of Mutulu Shakur that ultimately led to his arrest. We were unable to secure Sherry Dalton's arrest also. She continued to be a fugitive to the day that she died in Cuba.
And with Matula, the surveillance people realized, as they were obviously kind of building a relationship with some of his associates at this basketball court, and they realized there was one in particular that seemed to have the ability to possibly communicate with Matula or maybe even meet with him. But this one particular night, this person that they had the most suspicion of indicated he had to leave early. He had something important that he had to take care of. And that obviously got the attention of the surveillance people. And as I recall hearing the story, that he actually went to a very dark alley area where there was a payphone that appeared to be out of order. You couldn't get a dial tone or anything like that, but he stood inside this payphone booth, obviously surveillance people at a distance watching this. And sure enough, I think it was whether it was 8 or 9 o'clock at night, the phone rang. And he answered it. What we found out, obviously, that Matula was in the area and going to come in. And of course, our surveillance people were positioned when he did. They made the apprehension.
Let me again set the timeline. At this stage, where were you assigned in the late 1980s when all of these fugitive arrests were being done?
Well, I was a senior special agent. I was just a special agent and was not promoted until May of 1992 as a supervisor. So I was a street agent working on these individual cases before the task force was formed, and then subsequently from 1983 until 1992, when I was promoted and retired in the summer of 1998.
And now, Kevin, my understanding is that when all of this is going on, you are the co-commander of the FBI NYPD Joint Terrorism Task Force?
Yeah, it was interesting, Jerry, that titles NYPD had me as the commanding officer of the task force, and I always knew I was there as a partner. My FBI, Barry Morn, was my first partner, and I had several others after that. I was there from 82 to 86. They said they shouldn't have let me answer the phone because Major League Baseball called, and I left. I was fortunate that during my last 2 years that Marilyn Jean Buck and Matula Shakur were taken down, and I got to really see kind of the ending of this very important chapter, what had gone on for a number of years. My partner here, he may not have been in necessarily a supervisory role, but he was a critical ingredient in making a difference in these cases. His reputation and his contribution was particularly special, and that's why I wanted this teammate with me today.
Well, let me ask a basic question that maybe I should have asked at the beginning, because this group of people seem to come from such a diverse background. I mean, they're all races, they're all genders. What is their common purpose? What is all of this domestic terrorism activity that they're all gotten together for? What is their mission? I guess the word is, what is their beef? And did they all work under a common terrorist group name, Neil?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, the group was, as I indicated earlier, remnants of the Weather Underground movement in the post-Vietnam War era. The group, the Black Liberation Army, was the remnants of what initially was the Black Panther Party, and they commonly called themselves the Family. They were anti-government. They wanted to hide behind the cloak of doing these robberies to support the cause of the underprivileged. But in reality, they were a group of well-educated Caucasian women and members of the Black Liberation Army that were very attuned and well-schooled in military and weaponry. And so they were a good combination. But that, coupled with the fact you have to also understand, these groups interacted with each other. And we began to see that over the years between their communications, their safe houses, the way they approached and hid themselves. They were insidiously clever. But unfortunately, that day in October of 1981, they were a victim of reaching too far, too many times. And even after that robbery, they continue to rob and continue their expropriations to support their cause. But of course, by then, we had cooperating witnesses, and we were able to bring these individuals to court and prosecute them successfully. The one part I wanted to bring up that I think needs to be emphasized is the relationship, and this can't be understated, the relationship that the FBI and all our law enforcement partners with the United States Attorney's Office in both the Eastern District of New York, Charlie Rose originally played major roles in these cases, but the Southern District of New York, the U.S. Attorney, when this all began, John Martin, and later became Rudy Giuliani, and subsequently became Mary Jo White. The prosecutors on these cases were absolutely essential to prosecuting these individuals, beginning with the individual cases that I mentioned before. But in the Brinks case, you had Jane Parver, you had Bob Litt, you had Stacy Moritz, you had a team of support from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Later on, the second trial, you had the invaluable prosecutors of Carrie Martin Bartlett and Elliot Bruce Jacobson. These individuals played major roles, as they did in these other cases, in the World Trade Center bombing cases and the subsequent trials that led up to 9/11. The Southern District of New York and the Eastern District of New York were absolute partners in these prosecutions and working with the agents and the detectives in dealing with these trials. You have to remember, these trials were 6 months in length, each trial in federal court, over 100 witnesses. Many of these individuals had to testify several times and were placed in a position where they were reluctant. And it certainly was a moment in time that redefined their lives. And based on, instead of a good event in their lives, this was a lifetime of commitment to prosecuting these individuals, from the U.S. attorneys, assistant U.S. attorneys, to the witnesses and the securing of evidence over multiple jurisdictions, multiple prosecutions. They can't be said enough about the professionalism that the U.S. Attorney's Office played in all of these cases.
Definitely. We can do all the work and get all the evidence and do all the investigation, but at the end, we have to work hand in hand with the federal prosecutors for somebody to actually end up in prison.
You know, Jerry, just a brief mention, because it happened with the FALN, where the defense counsels were using the COINTELPRO every time an FBI agent would take the stand. And it became difficult to almost get the testimony because of their crying or screaming about the FBI previous investigation. So what one of the U.S. attorneys did in the Eastern District ended up, and I was the first one, said, hey, we got to turn this thing around. We got to get this testimony in, and put me on a stand in a grand jury in the FALN. And I think other prosecutors learned from that, so they could make the switch. We were interchangeable. And I think, again, the partnership obviously played a part in that.
Well, I think that was the main point that both you, Neil, and you, Kevin, wanted to make in reviewing this case, is that the NYROB case and those cases leading up to it is the beginning. It's the foundation. It's where law enforcement agencies learn to work together and to partner with each other in resolving these terrorism matters. Isn't that right?
Well, it's true, but if you think about it, it was, if you will, the terrorists showing linkage between them, sharing resources, sharing intelligence, etc. And yet back when, the FBI and NYPD were obviously competitors. So I think to a certain degree, we caught up with the terrorists as far as the organization that was working for them that ended up working for us.
You know, Jerry, 3 years ago, actually, at Kevin's request to the Rockland County District Attorney's Office and Sheriff's Department, he recommended that I speak at the memorial in Nyack, New York. They have every year, where the two police officers, Edward O'Grady and Waverly Brown, were murdered. It's a very solemn memorial. I spoke at the memorial and spoke about the victims. And to me, over my 25 years of working both domestic and international terrorism in New York, I was so inspired that day, and I'll say why. At the end, the day itself was in a driving rainstorm, and there were about 400 people there. They all stood in the rain, and I gave a speech, and there was an honor guard and personal comments made by several of the victims' families. It was a very far-reaching, uplifting, tragic day, but on the other hand, of all the awards, and this is not about me, of all the awards and accolades, to include the Director's Award, and all the personal awards that I received over my career, I received the day the verdict came in on Mutulu Shakur and Marilyn Buck from the two prosecutors, Elliot Jacobson and Kerry Martin Bartlett, who were there. And they gave me, after the trial ended, this pewter cup that I have here with me. It's a very simple gift that was given. It simply states USA versus Shakur and Buck, May 11th, 1988, with their initials and my initials. That, to me, is the most prized possession that I have in my home now. It was given to me because it was what I was trained to do when I started out in this job. I took an oath, as Kevin did, and I know you did in your time in the Bureau. And this is why I came into this job. I didn't come in for awards. I didn't come in for all the gratification and letters of commendation. I came in because what this case represented. And to me, this case represented, and as I said earlier, any agent or detective that worked this case, to include local authorities and investigators, this was the case that they all refer back to. This was the case that truly had a heartbeat. And I'm reluctant to mention names, but the fact is there were people like Tom Locke, Barry Maughan, Terry Cox, Bob Cordier, Walt Carroll, Kenny Maxwell, Dave Mitchell, Charlie Minch, James Cassidy, a whole host. And I hate to start naming names because when you do that, genuinely leave people out. But these were the people. These were the backbone of what the Joint Terrorism Task Force was formed for and why it was successful. And 40 years later, at our reunion just recently, we were honored by the New York FBI office and the New York City Police Department commissioners. Christopher Wray attended this reunion. The honorees were given plaques. It was a beautiful night. And two of the cases that were highlighted at this reunion was the 1981 Brinks armored truck, Major Case 37, and the World Trade Center bombing of 1993. And I was fortunate enough and lucky enough to be involved with these two investigations, one as an agent and then one as a supervisor, to help secure the arrests of two top 10 fugitives, Ramzi Youssef in Islamabad, Pakistan in 1995, and Mutulu Shakur in Los Angeles in 1986.
Jerry, I don't know how you can include this, but I know Neil would want to mention someone who was very special, who was with us from the very beginning to the end, and he was critical. And that was Lieutenant Phil Heumann of the Nyack Police Department, who truly could have been on any police department or any FBI agency task force, because he was so critical to what he gave us and how hard he worked to get us the success that we ended up achieving.
I'll just add one other thing to that, Jerry. The day that I got promoted in May of 1992, I got a phone call from three people, two in the Bureau, Ken Walton and Ken Maxwell. I got a third phone call from Phil Heumann, and he called me and he thanked me personally because he remembered that the day that we arrested Mutulu Shakur on February 11th of 1986, after I was contacted by Dave Mitchell and Dana Ingalls in Los Angeles, I was about to go back for my third tour on the surveillance of Mutulu Shakur. I called Phil Heumann personally at 4:00 in the morning and told him that Mutulu Shakur was arrested. He never forgot that. And the day I got promoted, he called me. And that meant a great deal to me. Unfortunately, Phil passed away just before 9/11. He was only 61 years old at the time. As a great friend he became to me as the years went on, I don't believe, in my opinion, he ever really recovered from that tragedy in Nyack, New York. And I'm going to give this gift that was given to me to my two grandchildren, who ironically live in Nyack, New York, with my oldest daughter and her husband.
Wow. That's kind of eerie.
Again, I don't like to mention that, but the reality is Nyack, New York, in a lot of ways represented everything that the task force was formed for. Unfortunately, it represents a defining moment in history as far as terrorism in America, 20 years before 9/11. But this beautiful town on a cool October day, now some 42 years later, is part of the task force as much as the task force.
It's fulfilling to hear that even today, even this year, they still continue to pay respects to the people, the police officers, and the armored car officer who lost their lives that day, that everyone in the town remembers what happened so many years ago. And it also gives me an understanding how much this means to you, that so many members of the task force continue to go and that they even ask you to speak at the memorial. That really says a lot about what this incident did to that community in October of 1981.
Jerry, I should also add that I'm on the board of St. Thomas Aquinas College, where I was for about 10 years and recently resigned, but I'm still on that Criminal Justice Advisory Council, and a professor from the local college here in Rockland Community College, had talked to me about the Brinks thing several years ago and said, gee whiz, I'd love to present that to the student body. I said, fine. I went out and recruited Neil and Kenny Maxwell and David Mitchell. They came from some distance with myself. I was just served as the MC. They did a spectacular job at RCC. I mean, this Professor Barrett, just every time I see him, he talks to me about it. It was, just as I'm sure you sitting there listening to us tell the tale, amazing what took place, the tragedy of it, what unfolded, what it led to. To me, it's a kind of a never-ending story of what police work and law enforcement is all about, is that we're all in this thing together. We care and we are committed. It doesn't matter your shield or your department. The important thing is to get the results. And because of people like Neil and others, detectives as well, that we're difference makers.
Well, I think the most important thing, and I know that I have a number of active agents and active law enforcement personnel who listen to the show. So I think the most important thing is for them to really understand whose shoulders they stand on as they go out every day and keep this country safe. They're on the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, not just in New York, but all over the country. We also need to celebrate them and the work that they're doing, because you know exactly how dedicated they must be to do this every day.
Jerry, at this reunion that Kevin and I and 300 people attended just 1 month ago, I was really impressed upon not so much the speeches, which were far and few between, which was good. Director Ray gave a very moving speech. But what impressed me the most, and I was so moved by it, that I called Mike Driscoll, the assistant director in charge of the New York division, the next day to thank him personally, that I was impressed with so many of the young agents and detectives that are now currently on the Joint Terrorism Task Force that really had a sense of history and understood how challenging these cases can be. That the public now demands success almost on a daily basis. But they were very interested in some of the problems that those that have worked on these cases over the years. And I was so impressed that it really left me with a good feeling, not so much from a historical standpoint, but really from a personal standpoint, that these young agents that are now going through some of these challenges that we see today on a daily basis, whether it's a crime scene at a school in Florida or a church in South Carolina or a synagogue in Pittsburgh or a shopping center in El Paso, what it really shows to me is the commitment of an ongoing law enforcement community that's willing to work to such lengths and make these kinds of sacrifices. Because those of us that served in law enforcement, I think, really need to understand that these kinds of sacrifices can never recover the loss of life or those injured in these kinds of defining moments in people's lives. It's inspirational, and I think it's inspirational that these young agents have the same fervor and dedication that I like to think that continues in the Bureau and all these institutions like the New York City Police Department and other agencies that work hand in hand in these events.
Beautiful. I think to work this stuff, you have to have something special, and they certainly do. You said that you have the cup that you received from the prosecutors, one of your prize possessions and awards from this NYROB case. I'd love for you to take a picture of it so that I can post it in the show notes for this episode so that we can all admire what it means to you.
I have the cup, and I'll give that to Kevin, and he'll get that to you.
Fantastic. I'd love to share that with everyone because it has a special meaning for you and now for us too. Kevin, I wanted to just take a few moments and talk a little bit about your book, which is called Over the Wall. It is basically a memoir of your career in the NYPD. And I am sure there are many chapters that cover the work that you did with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Why did you write the book?
Jerry, actually, I thought quite honestly that I was just so fortunate to have the career that I was able to have, and that I knew it wasn't me. Certainly, it was the unbelievable people like Neil and so many others, men and women in NYPD and in the Bureau, that gave me the opportunity. It's an amazing story about teamwork and being around people who were difference makers. This was the most wonderful part of the book, to talk and interview many of those people who served alongside of me and have their names in the book, because they never got the credit that they should have got for all that they accomplished. And that was a genuine pleasure. Jim Kallstrom, for one, who I interviewed probably 12, 13 times. He was not only a great friend and a great supporter, and telling me, look, Kev, I knew when you were with the task force that you were going to go someplace. He didn't know where, but Jim was so good. Kenny Walton, I mean, all these guys, me walking over there as really a rookie in the Bureau, and how they adopted me and allowed me to serve alongside of agents and detectives who were, again, clearly needed little supervision, because they were all about hard work and obtaining results. So the book is a great opportunity to talk about those experiences and those people and the difficulty of these investigations. I would hope, quite honestly, maybe in a small way, it is a bit of a recruiting manual, because in talking with NYPD Police Academy, retention and recruitment, very, very difficult these days. So I'm hoping that if people get a chance to read this, they'll understand how rewarding a career it is, and how it's really all about service and, once again, making a difference.
Well, I can tell everyone that you are the ultimate recruiter, because you were able to recruit your own son into going into law enforcement and becoming a special agent with the FBI.
Two sons, that is.
Oh, really?
Jerry, the other thing I think that is worth mentioning on these kinds of cases, and I think you could relate to it because of your time in the Bureau, but when you start this job, you become an idea, like in most professions. You're not really sure what you're getting into to a certain extent. I came from a St. Louis, Missouri. My father was a sports reporter that covered baseball, which is another common denominator that I have with Kevin. I grew up with baseball my whole life and was going to go into journalism. That was my educational background. But by the time I came into the Bureau and then ultimately ended up in New York, the part of the job, particularly in these massive investigations, whether it's one case or many cases over a career, you can't minimize, and I know Kevin could relate to this, as most people can in law enforcement or in the military or in some kind of public service. You can't minimize the support that your family, your partner, your wife, your children ultimately have to pay to support you and the cause of doing this. These are kinds of jobs, and it's done in other professions, I know, but there is a tremendous amount of support that's needed in these kinds of endeavors. This is not a 9-to-5 job. It's a job that oftentimes you miss holidays, you miss happy occasions, Thanksgivings, New Year's Eves, all kinds of events that happen in a lifetime that you can't really ever recover. But you always have to try and, again, deal with the realities that look at the victims of these horrific crimes and all those other events. And the support that you get from your family really is paramount in supporting you. It's the kind of a commitment that I'm very impressed, as I indicated, with these younger agents that are now going through the same kind of commitment that we saw 40 years ago and is continuing even to this day.
Let me ask you my standard question, Neil, and that is, when and why did you join the FBI?
Well, born and raised in St. Louis, my father knew a number of FBI agents in St. Louis. In 1970, under the director at the time, J. Edgar Hoover, there was a push of 1,000 new agents in the organized crime field. that was my opening to apply to go into law enforcement. I really was planning on a career in journalism. What happened was I applied and was accepted and ultimately was trained in Quantico, spent almost 2 years in Miami and came to New York. As my ex-wife kids me and tells me all the time that you were really in the wrong place at the right time. And I stayed in New York. The task force over the period of years, which started out as a singular squad, evolved into a branch where there were 3 supervisors to include both international and domestic terrorism. I was promoted, replacing Kenny Maxwell in May of 1992 and was a supervisor until my retirement in 1998. And New York was really a home. It was a big adjustment for me, as is most agents that come to New York that aren't from here, that get to know the city, the surrounding areas, the relationships that were built up over the years with the NYPD and other law enforcement communities, whether it's Secret Service, immigration, ATF, Coast Guard, bomb squads, was a big part, a very big part of me staying in New York with my family and putting up with the sacrifices, but never forgetting the victims, and the victims' families were the ones that really made the biggest sacrifice.
Thank you for that. Kevin, we're not going to have a chance to talk about it in detail in this particular interview. So if people want to learn more, they're going to have to go out and get your book. But I did mention when I introduced you at the top of the show before we started talking that you spent over 20 years as a senior vice president of security and facility management for Major League Baseball. I'm going to ask you both now to give me your last words. And I think that is a fascinating career segue.
Well, Jerry, I think what really helped me get the job, because there were much senior people than I that were very interested in the post. I was, again, the NYPD guy, detective lieutenant, certainly didn't have the rank or the experience that some of the head of agencies had. The chance that I was going to get this job were probably slim and none. It was really my diversification in that I had been with NYPD. And of course, I knew that going with the Bureau would increase my chances of employment in the private sector. And I honestly wanted to be the chief of detectives. I was not looking to go anywhere, but the city went broke. And I had 4 children, all in Catholic schools, tuition, et cetera, et cetera. So I knew my time had come.
The last thing that we need to do is the last words for Neil. What would you like to leave the people listening to this interview with? What is it that you really believe is important for them to understand about the work that you did and that still needs to be done?
Well, again, I hate to keep going back to the victims, but I learned in 1975, one of the elder agents in New York who was about to retire. And I remember he being at the Francis Tavern bombing in January of 1975. And he told me something that resonated with me and stayed with me. He told me that to work these cases, and although he was on his way out and never really had that much experience in the terrorism field, he told me something that still stayed with me all those years, something that resonated with me and caused me to reflect on working these cases of terrorism. He told me that if you listen carefully to the victims' families, and the witnesses of these cases, you'll find the truth. And I learned that in dealing with a victim in the bombing of Pan Am 103 from Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988. I interviewed on New Year's Eve a woman who lost her son, 21 years old, a student at Syracuse University. And another agent and I, we went out as agents did throughout the country. In New York, we had a large number of victims' families because there were many students and families that were located in the New York metropolitan, New Jersey, Connecticut area. And the agent and I were unable to get a hold of this woman who was the mother, her only child. We went there on New Year's Eve. That was 9 days after the incident. On New Year's Eve, after trying to get her attention and her agreement to interview us, we just went there on New Year's Eve, arrived there around 11 o'clock on New Year's Eve. This woman lived in a location in Westchester County on the border to Fairfield, Connecticut. And we came to this home. This was an estate with a massive amount of land and wealth. You had tennis courts, you had a pool, you had a small golf range. The house was dark. We drove up, knocked on the front door, went around to the back. Everything was dark. There were no cars, and it didn't appear as though anyone was there. And so I was about with the other agent to leave our cards and try to get in touch with this woman and conduct this personal, tragic interview. And I noticed before we just about walked away, there was this figure in the house, in the back, in a darkened room, some kind of a den or a library. And the figure was not moving. I thought to myself, wow, something's wrong here. We were really knocking loudly, trying to get the attention of this person. Finally, this woman, middle-aged woman, gets up from the sofa, comes to the back door. She identifies herself. We sit down and we conduct this interview on her son, go through personal effects, go through all the leading up to his travel, personal trip back to America. This is right during the holidays. After the interview was over, about 3:00 in the morning, she turned to me and she said to myself and the other agent, she said, "Tell me, Mr. Herman, what is it that you're ever going to be able to do to help bring my son back?" And forgive me, but it was a very personal time. I thought for a moment, because it was really a question I couldn't really answer. I only said to her, we will do everything humanly possible to try to bring the people that caused this horrific event to justice. That was how the interview ended. Of course, we did find out after a number of years that the Libyan government was responsible and financed the bombing placed on Pan Am 103, causing 270 people to lose their lives. But I kept in touch with this woman over the years. She passed away just after 9/11. But it was one of those moments that you remember, that these kinds of events that are defining moments in their lives that simply went sideways. And whether it's Nyack, New York, or the bombing of a plane over the Atlantic, over Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988, that the dedication of the people in the law enforcement community and around the world need to be aware that these victims go through this tragedy and have to deal with their sorrow and their pain. And that's what kept me going all those years on all these cases. It was something that I try to remember and put in the back of my mind.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a direct link to the show notes where you'll find photos of Neil Herman and Kevin Hallinan, photos of the police officers in the Brinks guard killed during the armored car robbery, and the annual memorial service in their honor. There are also links to articles about the 1991 Brinks robbery and the formation of the FBI-NYPD JTTF and that original Memorandum of Understanding. I've also included links to the other FBI retired case file review, terrorism case reviews of investigations mentioned by Kevin and Neil during the episode. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.